So tonight we are in the book of 2 Corinthians again, 2 Corinthians 11. This is the third of four final chapters in the book of 2 Corinthians, as the Apostle Paul is dealing with those who rose up against him and his authority, who put themselves forward, who we see, I think, were taking advantage of and likely in some ways mistreating at least some of the Corinthian brethren. Pride, arrogance was the issue among them. And so Paul continues this defense of his ministry, the authority that he has over them that they were rejecting. In the previous chapter, he had shown his authority and the scope of it to reach, as he says, even as far as you, where he had been the one who had first preached the gospel and brought that good news and the relationships that come with it to that area. And he had exercised the authority he had and the privileges and prerogatives he had for the benefit of the brethren, where these other folks are using their prerogatives and privileges at the expense of the brethren. And so here in 2 Corinthians 11, we want to read the first 9 verses of chapter 11. I wish that you would bear with me in a little foolishness, but indeed you are bearing with me. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I betrothed to you one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. But I am afraid, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. For if one comes and preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. For I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. Some translations there say the super apostles. But even if I'm unskilled in speech, yet I'm not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way, we have made this evident to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. And in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you, and will continue to do so. So here we see Paul begin to talk about a little foolishness. He said, you're going to need to bear with me for a bit on being foolish. He's going to show the folly of boasting in yourself and your accomplishments and your position, and basically putting the greatness of your person forward as the primary thing on your resume. That's what these other fellows, and he will call them in this chapter, both super apostles and false apostles. And so they're on the wrong track. They have the wrong authority, but they are putting themselves greatly forward. And so Paul says, well, the way they argue, the way they act, the way they promote, and, well, truly also what they promote, it's foolish. So let me show you that if that's the way that we're going to conduct this argument, what it would look like from my side, and how silly it would be. So he's going to be foolish to show the folly of their folly, and that will basically encompass the next 2 chapters. It's quite sardonic. Sometimes it's described as Paul being a bit sarcastic, although one time a friend of mine was telling me he was teaching on this section and said that Paul was using sarcasm here. One of the older sisters objected and says, brother, I don't think we should say that Paul was sarcastic. And he said, well, how would you describe it? She said, well, he's just being ironic. Okay, that'll work. He's being ironic. So it's sardonic, I think that's my best word for this. He's showing them what this folly would look like and what it does look like when other people apply it. And so that's what we'll have first. We'll have this bit of foolishness, and he's going to say why he wants to engage in this and try to keep the brethren from it, because he has betrothed them to Christ as a pure virgin. So that's half of our title tonight, a pure virgin. And then he's going to talk about the super apostles and how he was not behind them in the least. And I suppose if he was behind them in anything, it was taking the Corinthians' paychecks. And he said, is that really a fault? Well, it seems that they were using that to find fault with Paul. So we turn to the text again now. Verse 1, the pure devotion, the little foolishness that he's going to ask them to bear with. For he says, this is why I'm being foolish here, because I'm jealous of you with a godly jealousy. The Bible is kind of two minds on jealousy, and it depends on what we're jealous of and why we're jealous. We often talk about jealousy and romantic things as the green-eyed monster, that jealousy is destructive and jealousy causes so many troubles and so much heartache, yet God is a jealous God. So there's a rightful place for jealousy. In the conclusion of the Song of Solomon, it speaks about jealousy being stirred up when somebody was near the love there that was the subject of the story. And so there's a right place for jealousy when somebody is impinging upon something that's not theirs. And again, we particularly use this in romantic things, and Paul brings up here the image of a wedding, that Christ is the bridegroom. And of course, the church is the bride. And Paul said, my job, as it were, my job was to be the matchmaker. I helped set you guys up with Christ, right? I, as a friend of the bridegroom, as a friend of Christ, he said, I betrothed you to one husband. And so I wanted you to come and be joined with my friend. I brought you to Christ, that you might be the bride of Christ. And we think about the beauty of the bride of Christ, Ephesians 5, that lesson on husbands and wives. And the church is, there in her pure linen, without spot or wrinkle, no blemish, nothing like that, by the washing of water and the word. And we think about the beauty of Christ's bride. Of course, it's a beauty he made her. It's a beauty he gave her by his washing, by his word. But he says, Paul does, the intention is now that you be like a betrothed person devoted to a wonderful man, devoted to a wonderful bridegroom, that you will one day have the fullness of relationship with. And I'm trying to get you to that and to accomplish that. And then the way he stresses this and the way he puts it, to me, is just almost laugh out loud funny. If you think about what the Corinthians were, if you think about them from 1 Corinthians 6, right? The immoral will not inherit the kingdom of God. I forewarned you. He said about this, the idolater, the adulterer, the effeminate, the homosexual, the slanderer, the drunkard. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God, but such were some of you. You were washed, you were justified, you were sanctified, right, by the Spirit of our God. Well, here, Paul says, I've gone for this, that you might be presented, I could present you to Christ as a pure virgin. I got to tell you, there's a lot of things the Corinthian church is, but pure virgin is not one that would ever come to anybody's mind but Paul's, I don't think, right? But this is the effect of the word. This is the thoroughness of the cleansing in Christ. This is the new man. This is the newness of things. This is the extent of forgiveness, right? This is, you think about all the passages that talk about, like in Revelation, the the redeemed are given pure linen, bright and clean, and the pure linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Or from Isaiah 61, that he will clothe his people in righteousness, and he compares it to the bride and the bridegroom both being kitted out for their wedding. And he'll clothe them in righteousness. And so this is how much God will do for us. This is the thing that Paul is working for in this church, that they would be so cleansed, and then they would live a life of sanctification such that you can legitimately say, and without laughing out loud, here is the pure virgin bride of Christ, his church, coming for his wedding feast. And that is the picture we have in the book of Revelation, right? Revelation 19. Let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. And it was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. And so he says, right, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said, these are the true words of God. Or the picture of heaven of Revelation 21, verse 2, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And so in the best and greatest and highest sense, the church is this purified and beloved bride of Christ. And now you Corinthians, some of y'all, with these false teachers that there are there among you, some of y'all are getting in the way. You're meddling with the bride before the wedding. How serious would that be? All right. I have brought this pure virgin as a bride to Christ. And here you guys are. You're meddling. You're in the way. You are interfering with that. As he says, but I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray for the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. And so here's what we would hope for the pure virginal bride as she thinks about the man she's going to marry, that her mind is set on him, right? And the vows that, at least here in the last 500 years in English we've taken, that reserved and kept for him and him alone, forsaking all others. Well, he says, look, you guys are like the devil. Like the devil messed up the garden, you guys are trying to mess up the church. Eve was deceived by crafty words, right? Eve was deceived by the serpent in his craftiness. It was an intentional thing, no accident about it. It was intentional, it was purposeful, it was destructive. You guys are repeating that figure here in the church that I brought to Jesus. I don't think Paul wants to put up with that. So what we need is that purity and simplicity, right? The purity and simplicity of God's original law was, don't eat from that one tree, right? You got lots of trees around here. Dress and keep those. I put you under the instruction of all creation to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That should take up some of your time and energy. But the devil came and confused the matter. What did God say about this tree? Oh, and then the devil says, no, it's not going to be that way. And so Eve was deceived, and then Adam ate, and Satan twisted the scripture to the destruction and wreck and ruin of nearly everything. And then God has this massive reclamation project to put it all back together. Here we are in a major step in this reclamation project, bringing people who were so corrupted as the Corinthians back to this pure and virginal state, prepared again for Christ. And you're trying to run this same playbook. Get out with it. I don't need it. They don't need it. I don't want anybody to fall for what you guys are selling. Verse 4. Here's these ones who put themselves so much forward. For if one comes and preaches another Jesus, So we preach Jesus to them. And here these guys come, and they're going to have us another Jesus. They're going to have Jesus in some other way. They're going to have Jesus in some other teaching or a different spirit. I'm not sure if that means a different version or corrupted teaching of the Holy Spirit, or if that means a different attitude and mindset, a different way of life. But then he also says, or a different gospel. So a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel. And of course, Paul would have told the Galatians already before this, if someone comes preaching another gospel, let them be accursed. Well, if somebody brings these things, a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel, you guys bear with this beautifully. King James says, you bear with him well. Oh yeah, y'all can put up with that. Though what those guys do, that's not right, it's not proper, you guys have no problem with that whatsoever. But Paul says, you know what? I'm going to come and teach you something too. And he says in verse 5, I do not consider myself in the least inferior. The old King James, I'm not a whit behind the most eminent of apostles. That's what my New American Standard says, the most eminent of apostles. The King James says of this, the chiefest of apostles. The English Standard and the NIV both say the super apostles. This word behind this chief, super, most eminent is the word Hooper Leon. Hooper, these Hooper apostles. Or we might say, well, as some of these modern translations say, these super apostles. So here these guys put themselves forward. They put themselves above the original apostles. They put themselves as this new invented thing high up into the church that they didn't start, and it's not built on them. What's the church built on? The foundation of Christ and the apostles. Here come these Johnny-come-latelys, and they superimpose themselves in between the brethren in Christ and the apostles. And they put themselves as above the apostles. And Paul says, you guys are fine with that. That's terrible. No, it's the apostles. It's the apostles' words. I think about this kind of thing every time I see, and especially these ones irritate me. Some of these very feminist clergy, these ladies in particular, who you'll hear talk about the Apostle Paul in very derogatory terms. And I saw a clip somebody was sharing, because it's just egregious. It was a lady pastor saying that Paul was being misogynistic here in this text, and that she didn't have much use for him. Okay. That's where you'd see the back of my head as I went through the door. But people accept that. She had a crowd that was willing. She has a crowd larger than I do, oftentimes. So people will put up with this, who put themselves so forward. But Paul says, look, I am not behind these people. I'm not taking a back seat. I know they want to take up a position over me, as it were. I'm not moving back to the back of the bus. He says, verse 6, but even if I'm unskilled in speech, which again, we don't really think the apostle was. We have some of his sermons from Acts. We certainly know his mind from his writings, but this is the thing we already know, that we've been told that in Corinth, in some of the people in Corinth were being told that his speech is contemptible, right? He's not a very good speaker. And so even if I am that, which he's not saying he is, but even if that's true, but it's not. But even if that's true, he said, I'm not so in knowledge. Look, you may say I don't speak well, but you can't say I'm dumb. You can't say I don't know. You can't say, and this set of arguments here will prove it, you can't say that I don't know what I'm talking about. In fact, he says, in every way, we've made this evident to you in all things. You know, Paul came, as he would say in the first letter, he came knowing nothing but Christ and him crucified. That isn't because he didn't know a lot of stuff, but he knew that was the important stuff. He concentrated on the things of Christ. He might have been able to speak about all kinds of things. Philosophy, right? He certainly seems to know moral philosophy of the Greeks quite well. He quotes their poets. He evidently knew quite a bit about sports and enjoyed sports. All the metaphors that he uses of comparing various aspects of the Christian life to sporting competitions, boxing and foot racing in particular. He knew about that. He knew about all sorts of things. But what's important? What do you need to talk about? What do you need to share? What do you need to get people to concentrate on? Recently read in a Bible study I was in about King Solomon. And it says that he gave us, that he spoke thousands of proverbs. And it also says he knew everything about the trees from the great cedars of Lebanon and all the plants all the way down to, the vines that grew on the wall. So from the little vines to the great trees, Solomon knew botany like you wouldn't believe. And Solomon knew animals and all that. But none of that's in the Bible. Why? It's not needed. What's the Bible about? Moral and spiritual development, right? It does. When it speaks to it, speak truthfully about nature, about biology, about some things in science, but it's not a Bible. The Bible's not a science textbook, botany textbook, or whatever. Paul knew things, and Paul could speak, but he presented them Christ simply. He presented them Christ truly in a way that would benefit them. The object wasn't to know how good a speaker and how great the knowledge of Paul was. The object was to recognize the surpassing greatness of Christ so that you might believe in him and trust him and follow him in your life. That's what this was about. And so, in every way, we made this evident to you in all things. Yeah. I think the more you knew Paul, probably the more you'd be impressed with him. But these people were using his humility, his restraint, as reasons to discredit him. And that's kind of a moral backwards argument, right? There's a backwardness to that. You use the man's restraint as a reason to discredit him. And the next one will be about money. And so, did I commit a sin, verse 7, by humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel to you without charge? Am I lesser for the fact that I didn't take your money for this? Now, these guys, we're going to find they are more than happy to take the Corinthians' money. Probably telling the Corinthians, you're getting a deal here. We're really worth this. We really are. And when people pay for things, sometimes they do appreciate it more than if the thing is operated for or given to them for free. And so if they have to pay for it, they'll, we know they have some buy-in because they've literally bought in. And sometimes when there isn't that, and when that isn't demanded, there are people who will denigrate its value. They will not consider the real worth of it. And so Paul says, did I do something wrong in not taking your money? Now, I wish we could say this was a uniquely Corinthian problem, but I don't think it is. Some years ago, an older gospel preacher, sort of a grandfather type to me, in our age difference and different places in life. And we had some working together, both in the United States and overseas for a while. And this brother, he was a retired school teacher. He had taught junior high science for years while he preached at a small congregation. Once he took his retirement at the full and ripe old age of that, then he worked at small churches because he had a teacher retirement behind him. He didn't need the funds that somebody else might. And he really put other people forward, both the church he worked at for years, the churches that he worked with in his retirement. He put them in many ways above himself and his own interest, and he paid his own way in ministry. And there was me and a couple other fellas that were working with him in a thing. And one time he said, guys, he said, let me tell you, because none of us were making very much money. Somebody mentioned about an alternative of maybe preaching and on the side or preaching and supporting themselves. He said, if you want to be taken seriously in this, don't do it. He said, if you don't take the brethren's money, they won't value you. Like, okay. He said that in many ways that there were people, he said, especially preachers and elders at other places. He said they didn't value what he did. They did not, they didn't appreciate his work because he wasn't doing it full time. And he said, don't do it. He said, take their money. and it's sort of the same thing that they were using against Paul is what this brother thought had been a thought toward him, but not by people doing great promotion of error like these at Corinth, but brethren with whom he had relationship and brethren with whom he worked and brethren with whom he knew and respected. But he thought he would have been quite a bit more respected and maybe useful more in the kingdom if he had taken their money and not supported himself. Well, these Corinthians, especially these super apostle types, these guys are using against Paul that he didn't take their money. But he said, look, I did get paid by churches, just not you. Verse 8, I robbed other churches, taking from wages of them to serve you. So there needs to be a wage for work, right? The workman's worthy of his hire. That's a teaching of the gospel. The Old Testament one that Paul quotes in 1 Timothy on this topic. You don't muzzle the ox that threshes the corn. While somebody is working, somebody is worth the labor that they're doing. And Paul says, I was paid, but just not by y'all. Other churches paid me so that I wouldn't take money from you. And early on in the church at Corinth, with all the troubles there and what seems to be in some ways kind of a tenuous situation of many things, Paul thought in best judgment, I shouldn't take these people's money while we're starting up this church. And so other people paid for you. So I was paid. I'm worthy of my pay. But it's just y'all didn't do it. And I think when they didn't see it being done, they didn't appreciate Paul as a worker worthy of his wage because he didn't take it from them. So he says in verse 9 how this worked. When I was present with you and was in need, he says, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. So we go back and read in Acts 17 and 18 about how Paul ended up in Corinth and how, because of the persecutions in various places centered around Paul personally usually, Paul went from place to place while the support team that he had with him, originally a team of four people with Paul, by the time he got to Corinth, which was the fifth city along the way, the support team was left behind, helping the brethren in the newly established churches. But Paul, by himself, after leaving the persecution-plagued area of Macedonia, ended up in Athens, and that didn't prove to be all that profitable. And so he then moved on by himself down to Corinth, and that's where we know from the book of Acts in chapter 18 that for a while he even made tents. But then it says, when the brethren came from Macedonia, he began to fully devote himself to the word. That's Acts 18:5. When Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So when those brethren came from Macedonia, and the chief city of Macedonia was Philippi, and of course we know that in the book of Philippians in chapter 4, there Paul talks about the support they gave him after he left Macedonia, Philippians 4:15. After I departed Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once to my needs. So Thessalonica was close by, but then Corinth was quite a bit further on. But the Philippians, again, the kind of the central church of Macedonia, they repeatedly sent to Paul and helped pay his wages while he preached. And so the Corinthians didn't have to bear that burden. And In some ways, it was good for them that Paul didn't do that. But with everything in life, there's often a bit of a trade-off. And the trade-off was that by not taking wages from them, by supporting himself, and then being, and that they were opposed to. And so they did it on this matter of funds. So it's really kind of an odd argument. The other guy didn't put himself forward enough. There must be something wrong with him in that he didn't take money. Well, he probably wasn't worth it after all, right? Because if he's worth it, he would have got it. That some kind of argument like that's being advanced against the Apostle Paul. So they were using his own restraint against him. So, yes, the gospel teaches us through Jesus, the laborer being worthy of his hire, that through Paul, in the letters to Timothy, here, a long section in 1 Corinthians 9, that when preachers work, wages should be paid. But here it's used against him that he didn't do that, which just kind of shows you, if you don't like somebody, you don't like what they teach, you don't like what they do, there's hardly anything they can do that's right in your eyes. They will find a reason for complaint. But he says, I did this not to be a burden to you. And so at some point in that early part of the work in Corinth, maybe when the church was much smaller, maybe when, Paul was concerned that he's going to be driven out of there too, and so much so the Lord appears to him in a vision and says, don't fear, I have many people in this city. There was some point early in that history that it would have been some burden, don't know how big a burden, but some burden for the Corinthians to have supported Paul. But that temporary situation, again, just became another thing that the opponents of Paul said, well, that's something we can object to. All right, well, that is the bit of folly begun. The bit of folly will go further, and Paul will show the way that these people argue. And we see it's just kind of whatever argument they can seem to come up with. The way these people argue is not reasonable. It's not sustainable. It's not terribly even rational. But in the midst of an argument, people will use irrational, unsustainable, contradictory arguments. And we're going to see Paul turn the type of argument that they're making against them as he tries to assure the Corinthians that his is the right way and his message is really the truth of the gospel.